my privilege this afternoon to present to you Mori Rabbi, Chatani, Rabbi Michael Rosensweig, Shlita, Rosh Yeshiva, and Rosh Kollel at Yeshiva University. Rabbi Rosensweig is an alumnus of our yeshiva, and he's a Talmud Muvak of Moreno Rabbeinu Harav Lichtenstein Zatzal and the Rav Zatzal, and as today is one of the most preeminent Talmidei Chachamim and Lamdonim. Rabbi Rosensweig is impacting directly and indirectly as well on the Torah community at large, and has further demonstrated strong and courageous leadership and vigorously defending and strengthening the Masorah and Torah values. Rabbi Rosensweig's advice and guidance has proved pivotal and essential in determining the path of major Torah institutions in the United States, the RCA and the OU among them, answering major halachic questions and challenges. And Rabbi Rosensweig's sincerity and his authenticity engender love and respect in his Talmidim, and as a living role model of Torah b'Tiferet, inspires them to even greater heights in learning and Avodat Hashem. And as a result, his vast multitude of Talmidim already rank among today's Torah leadership in many parts of the world. And anyone who's been in Rebbe's Shiurim knows that they are startling in clarity and in depth, and Rebbe's innovative insights and the methodology have blazed new trails in halachic thinking and lumdus. And it is therefore a tremendous honor to present to you one of really, in my opinion, one of the great Gedolei Hador of our generation, my beloved Rebbe, Rabbi Rosensweig Shlita. Thank you so much.
So beautiful, thank you. So firstly, thank you very much for such beautiful words. You know, it's special to hear nice things from anyone, as I always say, but from Talmidim, and in this case also family members. You know, it's particularly very moving for me. As I say, my trips here are always really a pleasure to get to visit the different yeshivot and you know, witness and experience the growth that takes place during these years. And I think really there's a great deal of to admire in the way the different yeshivot in particular have navigated the last number of years through COVID and through terrible war that we're still in the middle of, how they've able to continue teaching and you know, implanting Avas Torah and you know, a derech which requires so much mental energy and emotional energy and immersion, even as you know, they've inculcated, you know, the sense of Avas Yisrael and Avas Eretz Yisrael, and you know, the sensitivity that is required to be here in these difficult times. But always is an added dimension for me because in the different places that I visit, in addition to places that I admire, there, you know, by this point there are a lot of the ramim of the different the yeshivot are talmidim of mine, as they are here. And Schreiber was. In addition to all the other relationships that we have, but he was one of the original Talmidim in my first year actually giving Shiurim. And then, you know, I had him 2 times actually when he came back from his stint here in Yeshivat Haretzion. And others also who are part of the staff here and, you know, colleagues and friends. So I have that when I go to the different yeshivot, and I certainly have it in Yeshivat Haretzion. One thing I have, you know, a dimension of my visiting to Yeshivat Haretzion, which is singular, is the element of nostalgia, as Rav Schreiber mentioned, because I am also Talmud of this yeshiva and have a great deal of hakaras hatov, you know, to my Rabbeim, first, of course, to Rav Avital, Zakharnu Livracha, but especially Mori Rabbi. By 2, you know, Rebbes who were called, I could call a Rebbe Muvhak. One was Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zakharnu Livracha, and the other, of course, was Moreno Rabbeinu, the Rav Zatzal, Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, and the role that they played in my own development and my aspirations is not something to talk about at this moment. But when I come, you know, when I return, I visit to Yeshivat Haretzion, there's always a flood of memories, all good, and a lot of nostalgia. And to me, it's a living memory, not something that is really in the remote past. And Rav Lichtenstein, Zechorno Levracha, and Rav Amital's presence and the imprint that they have that continues to make an impact is something very special. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I was asked to speak about Inyane Chanuka. It wasn't my first choice. I usually like to speak about the Masechta, but I guess people are in different places. So to use the terminology that was used to me, to make it something which is a Shabbat Kol, the suggestion was to speak about Inyane Chanuka. I like the topics. I just, as a result, I didn't really think it was so necessary to give Marmakom, because I didn't really want to distract people from the limud, especially learning Gittin, and it's, and I understand Parak HaMegarish, which, still in HaMegarish? Transitioning. But when I was Talmud in Yeshivat Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, who I'm representing today as well, and I was in the Rav's Shiur, I think it was my third year that we learned Gittin, and the Rav came in, and in the beginning of, the Rav used to learn whatever he, wanted to learn. He didn't necessarily feel bound by the yeshiva's choice. As far as I know, he never learned what the yeshiva learned. But it was always a surprise until he actually showed up. I'm sure he knew what he was going to be teaching, but it was part, I guess, of the drama that he didn't reveal it, until he was actually present. So there was always a lot of speculation in advance, as you can imagine, the rumor mill. But if your rumor mill is about what Masechta you're going to learn, that's quite a madrega also. So the Rav showed up the first day. We already knew that we were learning Gittin by then. That had leaked out, from some family source. But he showed up the first day, and he said that we were learning Gittin from Parak HaMegarish. And he said, I remember very, with a smile on his face, that, of course we have to start with HaMegarish, because everybody knows that that's really, the way you should start. That's where the, most important sugyas in Gittin are, referring to the Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Aleph, Gimel Gittin Psulim, and that year he was Korei L'Mafreya. He started from HaMegarish, and then he went, backwards in terms of the prakim. My own theory is that, again, he presented it as that's, of course, the way you're supposed to learn Gittin, but I think like 20 years earlier, he had taught Gittin from the beginning, so he, I think he just wanted, a change. But either way, it's the limud of HaMegarish is such a wonderful limud. I didn't want to distract you too much. And I figured a topic like Chanuka is something that, it's very important, obviously, and we look forward in 2 weeks to Chanuka, but that people can mostly handle without so much preparation. So what I'd like to do, and I want to leave time afterwards if they want to have meetings or questions as well. So I'll try not to take too long, even though it's a very big topic to do it comprehensively. What I'd like to do is examine two aspects of the mitzvah of Nerot Chanuka, the relationship between the Maisa mitzvah, the objective, structural aspects of the mitzvah itself, and how important that is, as well as what it conveys, the impact that it has, the relationship to its Pirsume Nisa, or Shevach V'Hodah component. There are other parallels to Nerot Chanuka when it comes to this issue, particularly Megillah, a little bit the Daled Kosos, some other issues as well. But the melding of these two themes, which typically are discrete in other contexts, in a very kind of integrated way in Nerot Chanuka, is something that stands out and is really singular. And I think it's critical to appreciating what the theme of Chanuka really is supposed to be, really about. So hopefully we'll develop that idea. Just to begin, just with a Rambam comment, since mostly we're going to be, focusing in the beginning at least on Shitas HaRambam. It's interesting to note that the Rambam decided to assign great prominence to the mitzvah of Chanuka, as well as to Purim. It was the Rambam's choice, to conclude Sefer Zmanim, with Purim, with Hilchos Megillah v'Chanuka, Obviously, once he was going to include it, it was likely to be towards the end, but you didn't have to include it at all. There are other ways that he could have integrated the halachos of Purim and Chanuka. There are other places they could have been inserted. And the fact that, he's critical of the Bahag in Minyan HaMitzvos, where the Bahag counted Chanuka and Purim and other mitzvos d'Rabbanan, the Rambam, of course, in the Minyan HaMitzvos, critiques that and asserts that only mitzvos d'oraisa should be counted in the Taryag mitzvos. That, of course, doesn't preclude an independent section that deals with Megillah and Chanuka at all, but the fact that he chose, to assign this kind of independent status and stature to these two mitzvos, given his insistence that they can't be part of Taryag mitzvos, is certainly worth noting. And more to the point, the culmination of any big section, always implies a certain importance. The Rambam's choice of terminology when he talks about these mitzvahs d'Rabbanan is very significant. I'm sure, on the one hand, it stems from the effort at accuracy. I'll explain in a minute. But beyond that, it has importance. The Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchos Megillah, in the Koteret, basically says, Yesh b'chlal on shtei mitzvos hasei midivrei sofrim ve'enon min haminyan. So he calls both Chanuka and Purim and Kriyas HaMegillah mitzvos midivrei sofrim. That is a very charged terminology, in Rambam writings. Without going into detail, but the Rambam uses this expression divrei sofrim, throughout his Yad HaChazaka. But the exact significance of the term is a matter of immense discussion and debate. There are divrei sofrims that seem clearly to be b'drabanan. There are other divrei sofrims, that likely are doraisa, including Kiddushay Kesef, which is one of the most famous ones. My own view, very briefly, I'm not, this is a topic in its own right. In the Rambam lore and the Rambam interpretation, there really is this massive debate. There are those who insist that, all divrei sofrims are drabanan, and they have, very strong basis or foundation, for their argument. There's clearly divrei sofrims, including Chanuka and Purim, which are definitely only d'Rabbanan. They're certainly not d'oraisa. Then there are others, equally adamant and, ferocious in their insistence that the Rambam holds that divrei sofrim is min Torah, because there seem to be very clearly cases that he calls divrei sofrim that definitely seem to be min Torah. My own view is that the Rambam uses the expression divrei sofrim in a more flexible way. It's his way of saying that there is a hierarchy that exists in a certain area of halacha. In other words, if there was only one, dimension of a particular theme, then that would be one thing. But what he means by the phrase divrei sofrim technically, as he himself explains in Sefer Mitzvos and in Tshuvos, is that the source of a particular halacha is a drasha. In the case of a doraisa, certainly. But what's significant about it is that the Rambam is extremely sensitive about the way in which the epistemological question, how we know certain halachos, and especially if there's a range of levels of performing a certain mitzvah, whether it's within a category or across different categories of halakha. So the term divrei sofrim establishes for the Rambam that this is either a second or third tier doraisa, or it's a d'Rabbanan, but one which is ke'en doraisa, and in some cases in which there is a kiyum doraisa. So the term divrei sofrim is his way, not of confusing us, but of establishing that, like in the hierarchy of categories, right, this is either a low d'Rabbanan or a high d'Rabbanan or a low doraisa. But more to the point, that it is a complex mitzvah, that kind of has elements of both. So, for example, one of the most famous examples, which I alluded to, Kiddushay Kesef. So, we derive Kiddushay Kesef from Kicha Kicha Mistei Ephron, and that even if you assume that is Doraisa, and if you look carefully at the language of the Rambam, you're learning Gittin, not Kiddushin. But if you look at the language of the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos, in Kiddushin, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, and in Sefer Mitzvos, and in his Tshuva, in all places he describes a three-tier approach to Kiddushin. He basically says, Kiddushin is Al Yidei Be'ila, he says, because that's what it says before Pakra, Ki Kach Ish Isha Uva Allah, in the psukim that introduce Gittin, in Parshas Kiteitzei. And then he says, and it's also a way to accomplish Kiddushin. I'm kind of speaking roughly across Pirush Mishnayos, Sefer Mitzvos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, Tshuvas. Another way to accomplish this, once you say another way, but you call the first way the quintessential way, so you're dealing with like tier number 2, is a Ayadei Shtar, based on the Hekesh of Yatzav Haisa. And then he says, and if you use Kesef, which is derived from Kicha Kicha, I'll say, i.e., which is imported from the world of Choshen Mishpat, unlike the Hekesh of Yatzav Haisa, which is a limud, but it's an internal limud within the world of Eben Hoezer, of Ishus, and of course, even that is not Kiddushei Bia, where you integrate the, intimate and the legal, parts of the Kiddushin. So that works as well. So that's what the Rambam means by Divrei Sofrim. And in other places where he's dealing with the Din D'Rabbanan, the Divrei Sofrim means, this is, like that third category of Daraisa, meaning it's a kiyum, even if it isn't, an absolute Daraisa in the purest sense. So when the Rambam calls Megillah and Chanuka mitzvos Divrei Sofrim, and he gives them their own section, and it's the culminating section of Sefer Zmanim, it's his way of promoting or projecting the prominence of these mitzvos. The fact that he concludes Hilchos Megillah by noting the enduring quality of Kriyas HaMegillah, even though it is only Midivrei Sofrim, Kol Sifrei HaNeviim V'Kol HaKsuvim Asinum Libata Limotza Mashiach Chutz MiMegillas Esther Harei Kayemes Kichamisha Chumshei Torah Ukalachos Shel Torah Shabal Peh She'enim B'Telim Li Olam. The Rambam's view is that in the future, right, the status of Sifrei Nevi'im and Ksuvim may change. The Rabbi insists this is only with respect to Kriya B'Tzibor. Now those who interpreted that that's what the Rambam meant, but certainly the Rabbi didn't understand it that way. He understood it as a more radical change. But Kriyas HaMegillah, even though the obligation to read it is only Midivrei Sofrim, that's going to be enduring. Even in Yemos HaMashiach, they'll continue to do that. That's the final word of the Rambam when he speaks about the mitzvah Midivrei Sofrim of Megillah. When it comes to Chanuka, the Rambam ends Hilchos Chanuka with a beautiful expression of the centrality of Shalom. But as we'll discuss in a moment, the Rambam chose, for reasons that need to be explained and that I'll suggest in a couple of minutes, the Rambam chose to develop the dinim of Hallel in Hilchos Chanuka. And clearly, Hallel is a very prominent theme. Whether the Chi of Hallel, that's not a Chi of Daraisa according to the Rambam either, it's also Midivrei Sofrim. But the fact that the Rambam held out the dinim of Hallel to the very end of Sefer Zmanim and integrated it, as we'll explain in Hilchos Chanuka, is striking. It's Einza Omer Ela Dorsheni, it needs to be explained. But the effect of it, just take a step back and explain a little better. Hallel, of course, is an obligation, that applies, almost all of the Moadim, with the exception of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Even when it doesn't apply, like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, its status and discussions about it highlight the nature of the Yom Tov. that the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos in Rosh Hashanah and in Chanuka, when he talks about Hallel, uses famously the expression that the reason in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur there is no Hallel, which is established already in the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, is because they are Yemei Yira V'Fachad, using the language in Nechos Chanuka, the Ein Bahem Simcha Yisera. So that's already a very important statement. But when it comes to the other Moedim, of course, the Rambam quoting Gemara in Masachet Erchin, that there are Yud Ches Yamim Shegomrim Bahem V'Sa Hallel, and then there are a few more days where we have a minhag to say Hallel. So basically on all of Sukkot you say Hallel, in the beginning of Pesach you say Hallel, on Shavuos you say Hallel, and so on. So it's, the Rambam's writing Sefer Zmanim. He begins with Hilchos Shabbos, then he goes to Eruvin, then he, also a very important editorial decision, after that comes Shvisas Asar, Yom Kippur, which he puts together with Shabbos, and not together with Yom Kippur, unlike the order of the tour in the Shulchan Aruch. After Shvisas Asar comes Hilchos Yom Tov. That would have been an excellent place to integrate the dinim of Hallel. If not there, then at least in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, or in Hilchos Sukkah. Or he could have mentioned, the absence of Hallel, both in Shvisas Asar and in Rosh Hashanah. Instead, he delays any discussion of Hallel till the very end of Sefer Zmanim, and right smack in the middle of the Chanuka. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but that too gives a certain prominence to Hilchos Chanuka itself. And I think a part of the strategy, so both the Rambam's conclusion about the role of Shalom, especially in the context of Chanuka, which partially commemorates, a military victory. So the final word, that he has about Chanuka is that when you have to choose, this is based on the Gemara in Masachet Shabbos, between Ner Shabbos and Ner Chanuka. Ner Shabbos, reflects the value of Shalom Bayis. Hoylafan of Ner Beisov and Ner Chanuka, Ner Beisov, and Kiddush Hayom. You have to spend money either on Kiddush Hayom or Ner Beisov or Ner Chanuka. So Ner Beisov Kodem Mishum Shalom Bayis. Sharei Hashem Nimchak Lasos Shalom Ben Ish Leishto Godal HaShalom Shekol Torah Nitna Lasos Shalom Ba'olam Sheneamar Drachei Darchei Noam V'chol Nesiv Al Se'ar Shalom. Beautiful ending. But again, all of this highlights that even though we're dealing with Mitzvah Midivrei Seferim, that we're dealing with themes, with perspectives and values that are critical to Kol Torah Kula, and certainly to Sefer Zmanim. So when we examine Dinei Chanukah and Dinei Purim, and especially the Rambam's perspective on them, it should be, particularly with an eye towards appreciating that, his reorganization of Kol Torah Kula, which is the Rambam's enormous contribution, the Rambam's structure and his systemization, in addition to his particular views about, every single halacha, are an immense contribution. I've often said, and I believe it, that's why I say it, that it's almost impossible to appreciate the Rambam's contribution because it is so immense. And we all live in a post-Rambam world, so we benefit, from his enormous erudition, but more than that, his, total immersion in the system that produced a reorganization, that is critical to a proper conceptual understanding of all of Torah. And because we all live in, basically benefit, from the halachic world was never the same after the Rambam's work, surfaced. And that's the world that we all have been born into. It's hard to take the step back, and realize just how enormous the contribution is. But the systemization is something that the Rambam totally gets credit for. But it also behooves us, therefore, to read the Rambam with a magnifying glass. To always be careful to scrutinize where he puts things, what order he puts things, what he gives prominence to and what he doesn't, in addition to the specific shitos and interpretations, that emerge from his psakim, and what they reflect about how he read the Gemara. So that's what we're going to try to do a little bit more, and then to bring it into some actual halachic issues. So let me start with that was a little bit of a Rambam introduction, but let me start with something very more concrete. The Mishnah says, the Gemara says in Masechet Shabbos, when it talks about Chanuka, to get more specific. So the Gemara starts by Chanuka. So let me make a comment on that as well. Per se, the words my Chanuka are hardly problematic, right? We all know how to translate them. Nobody needs a Jastro. Is Jastro still around? Oh, very good. I'm happy to hear. See, Jastro has not been eclipsed. Okay, that's good. So Marcus Jastro. The my Chanukah, the words are not difficult to translate. However, the phrase my Chanukah is an unusual phrase. We don't find my Purim, we don't find my Pesach, we don't find my Shavuos, and even though the words make total sense, it's a strange usage in its own right, and certainly relative. You don't find it in the Gemara that they ask this kind of a question. I would translate my Chanukah as a classification question, or as a deeper question. What is the quintessential theme of Chanukah? I mean, there are many facts surrounding Chanukah, its past history, different events that took place before, after the victory. Obviously, the Neros of Chanukah, the Nes Pach Shemen. But what is it specifically that we should focus on that kind of crystallizes, right, the singular focus, that we should walk away from for Chanukah? My Chanukah. So the Gemara says, the Tan Rabbanan, the Chafei Bekislev Yomi the Chanukah Tzmanya Inun, the Lola Mispad Bahun, the Lola Sanan Bahon. This is a day of Megillas Tainus. It's a day of Simcha, these 8 days, no eulogies, no fasting. They ritually defiled, they were metame, the shmonim in the Heichal. Everybody's familiar with this brisa. So it's very striking that the story that the Gemara focuses on in terms of his background is not the Milchama, but the Nes of the Pach Shemen. There's an oblique reference, Kishagavra Malchus Beis Kashmonai V'nitzchum, that there was a war, that there's a Malchus that emerged, that there was a victory, but all that is background. It's all about the Nes Pach Shemen. That in itself is peculiar. One would have thought, that the Milchama would eclipse, the Nes. One is a necessity. We're hearing a lot in the last year and a half about, an existential, issue of survival. Certainly that's what the Chashmonaim faced as well. They needed to emerge victorious, otherwise, spiritually and physically, they would no longer exist. But instead, the focus is on the Nes of the Pach Shemen. This is very well known. But what's even more fascinating is the transition in the opposite direction that then follows. So, Nasa Bones, Sidlikum Imenu Shmona Yamim, and then Lashon Acheres, Kivaum Ve'asaum, Yamim Tovim, Bahalel Ve'hodah. The next year, the powers that be got together, and they tried to determine how you should commemorate Lidoros Chanukah, right? And what they established was, and here you can put quotations around these words, but then we have to define them, Yamim Tovim, Halel, and Hodah. Nothing in those words that obviously at least signify Neros Chanukah. So you have two opposite problems. You have the prominence of the Nes, in the background as opposed to the Milchama. And then when it came to the kvius and the asiya, again, if you ask anybody, except somebody who's really a contrarian, and I like contrarians, but most people will, if you ask them what's the symbol of Chanuka, what stands out prominently in what we do, so they will say the Neros, right? The hadlaka of the menorah. Instead, it's kiva'um bi'asa'um yamim tovim b'halel v'hodah. So the excessive prominence of the menorah, in the background, and then its evident absence in the program of commemoration, each one is strange, and the combination is, geometrically strange, we could say. So it's important for us to understand why that is. There is a discussion in the Achronim in general. The Maral discusses this, and then later the Sfas Emes, and I'm sure others, who suggest that, why it is, for example, that in Al Hanisim, which we, recite in Birchas Hamazon and in Tefillah during this period, like the focus is on the Milchama, clearly, and there's barely a reference or a hint even to the Nes of the Ner Chanukah. And of course, given the emphasis in the Brisa, that's particularly interesting as well. So both the Maral and the Sfas Emes and others make an interesting ha'ara, and that is that typically, if you're going to say Hallel, or you're going to create a holiday, you don't typically say Hallel or make a holiday because a nes took place that enabled the performance of a mitzvah. Right? We don't find that usually. Usually, Hallel and a holiday relate to Nitzachon, Yeshua. The ability to perform a mitzvah is obviously a wonderful thing, but that it should be reason for a holiday or reason to break out in, Shevach v'hodah to the Rabban Shem. We were in a moment, we had a crisis, there was no shemen, they couldn't light the ner that right in the beginning, of the reconstituted Beis HaMikdash, but this miracle took place, and therefore we're making a holiday. That's a point that they make, and that's why they suggest that Al Hanisim has to focus on the Nitzachon. However, that just makes it, more problematic that the background of the Brisa is all about the Nes Pachshemen, and for the Rambam, as we'll soon see, it makes it even more problematic to understand what the words of the Brisa mean. So what do the words of the Brisa mean? How do we commemorate Neros Chanukah? So Rashi Alatar famously says, Hachi Garsinan, Asa'um Yamim Tovim B'Halav V'Hodah, Lo Shasurim B'Malacha, Ela Nikvu Likros Halel V'Lomar Al Hanisim B'Hodah. So Rashi, has to engage in a little parshanut. He has to reread the Gemara a little bit. He assumes that this is the only way to read it. It sounds like the Gemara was saying there are three elements as a triad, right, of Yom Tov, Halal, and Hodah. But Rashi says Yom Tov signifies Isur Malacha. There's no Isur Malacha on Chanukah. So obviously what it means is that it's a Yom Tov of Halal v'Hodah. So calling the obligation to commemorate through Halal and Hodah, calling that a Yom Tov is very mechudash, we'll say, for Rashi. So even Rashi's view, which we're not going to focus on right now, requires some understanding, and hopefully what we say about the Rambam will help for that as well. The Rambam understood the Brisa differently. And this is a great example of Rambam Parshanut. Again, we know Rambam as a posek. We know Rambam as somebody who reorganized Torah Shabbal Peh, as I mentioned before, and doesn't get as much credit as he should for it, since we're all benefiting, so much from it, etc. But as we know from our daily, immersion in Gemara and in Gemara Be'iyun, the Rambam was, before he was a posek, he had to be a parshan of the Gemara, right? He had to read the Gemara in a certain way. He had to, decide what these words mean. So again, what I said about the Rambam is also true about Rashi. We live in a post-Rashi era, so we tend to assume, that everything, means what Rashi says, because Rashi's contribution, like the Rambam's, but on the Parshanut level, was so transformative, that, you don't say Rashi reads the Gemara this way, unless you know that somebody argues. You just say that's what the Gemara means. So the Rambam had a different tradition than Rashi, and like Rashi, he had immense confidence and conviction. He came to a certain conclusion. So how would we determine how the Rambam read this brisa? I mean, Rashi wrote a perush on the Gemara, right? So if there's a dibra maskil, we're in luck. The Rambam didn't. It's more difficult sometimes, to find how he read the Gemara. The Rambam actually did write a perush on some Masechtas, but that, we don't have very much of it. We'll leave that for now. So the answer is, sometimes, if you look carefully in the Rambam's code, and you see the order or the language that he uses, you can tell, when he is actually, being mafarish a Gemara. And this is a great example of that. The Rambam begins Hilchos Chanuka Perek Gimel, because first two prakim are Megillah. The Bayis Sheni begins with a little bit of back history. The Bayis Sheni K'Shemolcha Yavam Gzeira Gazru Gzeiros Al Yisrael Bitlu Datam. Right, they imposed Gzeiros and they, canceled the religion. They forbade the exercise of Torah mitzvos. V'hiniach osam, hinichu osam lasok b'Torah mitzvos. And then pashtu yadam b'mamonam b'bnosayim nichnasu laheichal partzu b'pratzos timu ataharos tzor lahem liyisrael ma'od b'pneihem lachatzum lachatz gadol ad sharicham aleim elokei avoseinu hoshiam miyadam hitzilam v'gavru b'nei chashmonai kakonim agdolim the hargu v'hoshiu es Yisrael miyadam v'amidu melech min hakohanim v'chazra malchus liyisrael. The Gemara makes reference to malchus Chashmonai. The Rambam embraces it more. This in contrast to the view of the Ramban in Parshas Vayechi. Yisrael Masayim Shana Ad Churban Habayis Hashem. So the Rambam begins his discussion of Chanuka with historical background. Rav Soloveitchik, noted this. He says Megillah, we don't talk about the historical background. His take on that was, well, there's Kriyas HaMegillah. So Kriyas HaMegillah provides, the context for Purim. There's no Megillah, at least no sanctioned Megillah, Kriyas HaMegillah, and Chanuka, so it's important to provide the back history. What I'd like to suggest in a few minutes is that, of course that is true, but there's an additional, I believe, element in the way that the Rambam portrays the history, and particularly in the use of the term Gazru Gzeiros Al Yisrael Bitlu Datam V'lo Hinichos Lasok B'Torah Ubemitzvos, which invoke, well, I'll tell you now, and then I'll explain why I think it's significant later, which invoke language that we find in Masechet Sanhedrin and in Parakeh Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah. There, the Rambam discusses, and in that sugya, the Gemara discusses, the conditions of the Sirus Nefesh of Yeharig Val Yavar. When are you obligated even to give up life itself, notwithstanding our perspective on the sanctity of life? When is there an obligation to give up even life itself to express your loyalty to the Rabbanu Shalom? So there are three categories. One is the Gimel Averos, right? What is our Shvichus Damim Gilia Rayos. The second is Bifar Hesya, based on the concept of Kiddush Hashem Barabim or Chilul Hashem Barabim. And the third doesn't have a source, but the Gemara calls it Shas Hashmad or Shas Hagzeira. And if you look at the language of the Rambam in Parakeh Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah and the Gemara, and then you read Hilchos Chanuka, the Rambam is basically saying that the background of Chanuka was that it was a Shas Hashmad. Now, the fact that there is a Chiyuv Yeharig Val Yavar and a Shas Hashmad, is something that needs, one would think, an explanation. The Gemara says Afilu Mitzvos Kalos and Arkasa de Misana, famously, you're supposed to give up your life. But the fact that there's no source in the Gemara in Sanhedrin or in the Rambam when he quotes it is significant. Not something that people talk about much, as far as I know, but it's certainly something that troubled me. So I believe that the background of the Rambam and the use of terminology that links the context to Shas Hashmad is critical, as we will explain. Okay. Then the Rambam continues in Halacha Beis. He says, "Ukeshegavru Yisrael al oiveim v'ibdum b'chamisha v'esrim b'chodesh Kislev haya v'nichnasu lahechal." Now this part, Halacha Beis, is practically a direct quote from the Brisa of my Chanuka. So really, Perek Gimel, Halacha Aleph through Gimel, is the Rambam's Parshanut on my Chanuka. We're just lucky that we know that. We know that because we can see that that's what it, signifies. This is a great example. The more you learn and the more you think, carefully about the things that you learn, the more illumination, you get. Like if you have these words in your mind and then you read the Rambam and you make the association, like the little light bulb that goes off and, a little bit of an epiphany, and then you're in a position to assess and to, find connections or find themes that otherwise you might miss. Anyways, lo matzu shemen tahar b'mikdash ela pachechad v'lo yibal lahadlik ela yom echad bilvad v'idliku mimenu neros hamaracha shmona yamim. He adds words that are important but not for now, like maracha. Shmona yamim ad shekatshu zeisim ve'otziu shemen tahar. This is his parish of the Brisa. But now we come to the, the key, halacha gimel. And that is, like, how do we commemorate this? So the Gemara used the expression, Yom Tov Halel Hodah. The Rambam says, again, it's a translation almost. Milel Chamisha V'Esrim B'Kislev. Yimei, right, here comes the drum beat, Remember, Yom Tov Halel Hodah, right? So you're drum beating, that's good. Simcha, says the Rambam, Halel umadlikin bohem neros ba'erev al piskei habatim b'cholayla v'layla mishmonas halelos laharis ulagalos asanes. That last part was a very long sentence. I broke it up, into 3 parts, but it's really one. So what are these 3? So for Yom Tov, unlike Rashi, who says it's a Yom Tov of Halav Hodah, the Rambam thought Yom Tov was part of the triad. And he interpreted, but he knew Yom Tov, like Rashi, wasn't Isra Malacha. So instead he zeroed in on another facet of Yom Tov. And that is, Yom Tov typically conveys Simcha. Right? There's a difference between the Oneg of Shabbos, right, and the Simcha of Yom Tov. Ramban in Toras Adab says that's why Avelus is destroyed, wiped out completely by Yom Tov. It's only, held in abeyance, by the Oneg of Shabbos. Anyway, other things. So the Amshel Shlomo, the Marshal, says, based on the Rambam's formulation of Simcha, it could very well be, unlike the position of many of the Balitosis, Chachmei Ashkenaz, other poskim, that there would be a Chiv Seuda on Chanuka, right? Typically, when you make a Suda on Chanuka, everybody always tells you have to say a Dvar Torah to make it to a Sudas mitzvah, because unlike Purim, right, which focuses on the Suda part, like there's no evidence that Chanuka there is a Chiv Suda. So if you want to make a Sudas mitzvah, either way, it's a good idea. You should be choshesh for that. Can't hurt the Dvar Torah, right? If it's a good Dvar Torah. But according to the Marshal's reading of the Rambam, actually, these are Yimei Simcha. Now, Simcha could express itself in other ways, but he thought that according to the Rambam, certainly Seuda would be a Sudas mitzvah simply on the basis of this. Okay, so that's point number 1. What about Hallel? So Hallel, the Rambam says Hallel. Nothing to say, right? Except that, as I alluded to before, the Rambam has a very striking presentation of all of Hallel. In other words, if the Rambam had put, Hallel, like we would have anticipated, in Hilchos Yom Tov, or at least with Pesach or Sukkot or something like that, and then he said, one of the things, the second thing after Simcha is Hallel, right? So then we would end this year a little earlier because, there wouldn't be so much to say about the Hallel. But as noted, the Rambam did something remarkable in his, systemization of everything. He, delayed the presentation of Hallel when it applies to Moadim Doraisa, right? And instead, he integrated it into Hilchos Chanuka. But as we'll see in a moment, it's more than that. So let me talk about point number 3 before I get back to point number 2. What is point number 3? So the Gemara says Hoda'ah. Rashi says Hoda'ah means Alanisim. The Rambam doesn't say that. There's no word Hoda'ah here, and certainly Alanisim on the Karshemei. The absence of Alanisim, is consistent with the Rambam's view that Alanisim, while it is a Haskara, is not, it's a reflection, it's not a Machayim. The Rambam never speaks about Alanisim in all of Hilchos Chanuka. He only speaks about it in Hilchos Tefillah, when he talks about the insertion in Tefillah. And that wouldn't be appropriate if he felt that the word Hodah meant Alanisim, which he doesn't. But the word Hodah itself is missing, and instead, what did we ask? On the one hand, the background of the Gemara, of the Brisa, isn't the Muhammad, it is the Nes of the Pak Shemen. But then when it comes to Asa'um and Kiva'um, right, we have no reference to Neros Chanukah. It's Yom Tov, Hallel, and Hodah. And according to Rashi's take, that's certainly true. And according to the linguistically, what is implied, that is certainly true. But the Rambam evidently thought that the word Hodah in the Gemara, in the Brisa, actually refers to conveying Hodah by means of the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. And that is exactly what he writes. And that's why it's written in such a verbose way. Again, the Rambam says, after Hallel, umadlikin bahem neros, and notice what he inserts in this pithy statement, or not pithy statement, ba'erev. Why ba'erev? Because that's the time when it's mefarsei misanes. Al piskei abatim. He's going to tell you all this later in Perek Daled, when, where, but even now, because he's trying to explain why this is Hodah, al piskei abatim, right? In the, where everybody can see it on the door or near the door. Bichol laila v'laila mishmonas haleilos, right? Every single one of these. There's a whole discussion whether you go down and count, you go up and count. The Rambam is suggesting that whole discussion has to do with the question of Pirsum Anes, and then he adds words which are beautiful words: laharos ulagalos esanes. Later on, I should add, the Rambam concludes, Yomim Elu Heinu Nekraim Chanukah, Hein Asurim Behesped V'Tainus Kimei Purim. He's flipping the order of the Brisa. V'Hadlakas Neiros Bahen Mitzvah B'Divrei Sofrim Kikrias HaMegillah. It's here where he mentions this higher form of Drabanan, Divrei Sofrim. And that is interesting because Megillah is Divrei Sofrim. It is actually references, or remazim at least, in the Torah itself, to Esther, to Haman, to Kriyas HaMegillah. You don't have that in Chanukah. Nonetheless, the Rambam calls it Midivrei Sofrim. If you look at the end of the Rambam, the last substantive halacha of Hilchos Chanukah, so let me explain what I mean by that. Before I quoted the last halacha, which is Perek Daled, halacha Yud Daled. That's where he talks about Shalom, and Yud Gimel and Yud Daled are talking about this question of, you only have limited resources. You can either spend it on Kiddush or the Neros of the Ner Chanukah, the Neros of Shabbos, etc. Those are more interesting peripheral halachas, and of course the Shalom, beautiful formulation in the end is a very beautiful ending. But the last real statement about Ner Chanukah in its own right is halacha Yud Beis, and there he says, Mitzvahs Ner Chanukah mitzvah chaviva hi ad ma'od. Like where else in all of Yad HaChazaka does the Rambam describe any mitzvah, right? Never mind a mitzvah that's only Medivrei Sofrim, as a mitzvah chaviva ad ma'od, beautiful language, an exceedingly, precious or beloved or endearing mitzvah ad ma'od. It's interesting, the Bali Tosas asked the question why we say the bracha of Sha'asan Nisim Lavosenu, what we call Birchas HaRoeh. Why do we say that in Nerot Chanuka? We don't say it. Typically, you do a mitzvah, make a bracha on the mitzvah. You don't make a separate bracha when you see somebody do the mitzvah, right? So the Tosas asks this question in Shabbos, on Daf Chav Gimel, and at the very end of Masechet Sukkah. And Tosas gives him different answers. One of the answers that Tosas gives is that the mitzvah of Chanuka is kaviva hi ad ma'od, or kaviva hi ma'od. Very similar to the language that the Rambam uses, independently of each other. They didn't know of each other. This idea that Ner Chanuka, is a particularly beloved mitzvah is an amazing idea. It's a beautiful way to finish Hilchos Chanuka, but he goes further. Tzarich adam lehizaher ba. So I would just add, nobody else makes this comment that I know of, but I think it's worth noting. Typically, the word lehizaher is not used about a kiyum mitzvah. It's used, you should be careful not to violate an isur. There are a few exceptions. Azhara has a negative connotation. I'm saying this is such an exceedingly beloved mitzvah that you should really treat it, like a fragile, but incredible opportunity. You have to be cautious and careful about it. And then he adds, Kidei lahodia hanes. Here's where you get the mitzvah. Here isn't just a mitzvah with a purpose, but it also is a communication. It's a mode of communication. Ulahosif b'shebach hakel. This is all language that the Rambam uses on his own, right? And to add to the Ribono Shel Olam shebach, that essentially is Hallel. Vehodaya. Finally, we got the word hodah that was in the Brisa, right? It ends up, the last word pretty much about Nerot Chanuka in the last halakha that describes it. Alanisim she'asalanu. And then he says, also of important Kiddush, afilu ein lo mayochel ala min tzedakah, sholem ocher ksusa v'lokeach shemen v'neiro suman. Even somebody who doesn't have the funds, is obligated to associate himself with this mitzvah chaviva, which is modia and esanes, mosif hashabach, and constitutes hoda'ah. So this, of course, confirms the idea that in Halacha Gimel, Perek Gimel, Halacha Gimel, that the Rambam is actually translating the Brisa's hoda'ah by suggesting that it means the Ner Chanuka, and that is an expression of hoda'ah. But still, this is very atypical. Like, what does that mean, that the mitzvah, communicates, or that this mitzvah is unique? Its chavivus is unique, and that the focus, is the lesson or the impact that it has, the pirsum hanes. But before we get to that point, let me go back and speak about the hal. In light of the Rambam's view of the hoda'ah, excuse me, so, and of course his comment that it's lahodia hanes ulahosif b'shevach hakel, even before you get to the hoda'ah. So let me point out a couple of more points about the Rambam's formulation of Hallel here. So it's interesting that not only did the Rambam hold out Hallel, till the very end of Sefer Zmanim, and in the context of the Divrei Sofrim mitzvah of Chanuka, he didn't, take the opportunity, the earlier opportunity of integrating it into these other more obvious, and earlier, in order cases. But I've always thought that how he integrates it, and the word integrate is really the right word here, as you'll see, is also very astonishing and very significant. The Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Chanuka, we read Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. Now we should read Daled. So what is Daled? Kol shechayev b'kriyas hamegillah chayev b'hadlakas ner Chanuka. Good, that's fine, right? Because he said it was Divrei Sofrim like Megillah, right? Which so he's following through with that connection, and of course this is Hilchos Megillah b'Chanuka. And he didn't make them separate, he put them together, the two divrei sofrim. And then he says, Van madlik also b'leil rishon, mevarch gimel brachos ve'eluhein, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvosav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanuka. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam sh'asa nisan l'avoseinu bayamim ha'im b'zman hazeh. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam she'achiyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu l'zman hazeh. The kol haroa osa v'lo birach is the birchas hara b'varich shtayim sh'asa nisan l'avoseinu v'shechiyanu v'shar aleilos, etc. Okay, so the Rambam describes the background of the mitzvah and so on. Then he has the mitzvah and the commemoration, and now he's ready to speak about the mitzvah of hadlakas neros Chanuka. So the first thing he says is the brachos, kol mitzvahs mevarchim aleim over l'asiyasa. So far, so good. What should be the next halakha? Right? What should be the next halakha? The hadlakas neros Chanuka. Anything else would be a diversion, right? It would be a hefsek. Not allowed to be mafsik between the bracha and the hadlaka, right? It shouldn't be mafsik between the halacha of the bracha and the halacha of the hadlaka. What do you think comes next? Lo and behold, Perek Gimel Halacha Hey, the next halacha, B'chol Yom B'Yom B'Shmonas HaYomim Ha'elu Gomrim Es HaHalel. Wow. Umavarach lefanav Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvosav v'tzivanu ligmar sahala ben yachid ben tzibur. The next, this goes from Perek Gimel Halacha Hey until, I'm not going to read all the halachos, until Halacha Yud Dalid, from Hey to Yud Dalid, 9 halachos. That finishes Perek Gimel, and then comes Perek Dalid Halacha Aleph. Perek Dalid Halacha Aleph is finally Kama Neros Umadlik B'Chanuka Mitzvasa Shiyeh Kol Bayis Ubayis Madlik Nerakon. The Rambam's take on the 3 ways to accomplish Neros Chanuka. In other words, he's mafsik between the bracha and the hadlaka, I don't mean literally, but in his presentation, with 9 halachos that complete Perek Gimel, right, until the beginning of the 4th Perek. And what is he mafsik with? Hallel. Okay. Another insight, I think, again, something that occurred to me at least. The Rambam, when he wants to explain the bracha that you make on Hallel, says, Afal pi shekriyas Hallel b'divrei sofrim, mevarech aleha, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, kederech shemevarech ala Megillah v'ala Eruv, shekol vadai shal divrei mevarchin alav. So, we all know that you make a bracha and you could say the word v'tzivanu, even if a mitzvah is rabbanon, right? That's what the Rambam is saying. That's why you can say this word v'tzivanu for Hallel. Except there's one little ha'ara, or maybe big ha'ara, to make. How do we know that? It's a Gemara. It's a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos and Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. But the Gemara says, how can you say v'tzivanu? It's only drabanan. What does the Gemara say that with respect to? Not Hallel. Neros Chanuka. The Gemara in Shabbos on Chav Gimel says, what bracha do you make on Neros Chanuka? That's, the sugya of Neros Chanuka, as we know, is in Bameh Madliket. So in that context, after the Gemara tells you the bracha, the Gemara says, wait a minute, it's not Doraisa, how could you say V'tzivanu? And then the Gemara says, Lo Sasur, and Shalavicha V'yaged Kaz Kenecha V'yomrulach. And that became the paradigm, for all brachos drabanan. But when the Rambam copies it, right, in Hilchos Chanuka, in the hefsek between the bracha and the hadlaka, right, he quotes that Gemara, or applies, as if the uber case isn't Neros Chanuka, it's Hallel, right? It's not that it doesn't apply, it's not a problem, but it is a decision, a conscious decision. Why did he do that? One other point. The Rambam in the Koteret to Hilchos Megillah v'Chanuka, as I mentioned, says there are 2 mitzvos, midivrei sofrim, right? Again, calling Megillah divrei sofrim is one thing, calling Chanuka is more mechudash, but it fits in. There are 2 mitzvos midivrei sofrim, the einan min minyan, because he's critical of the Bahag, you can't count them in Taryag, but he's still giving it its own and culminating section. And what are they? They are, as we know, Megillah and Chanuka, Hilchos Megillah v'Chanuka. but there really are 3 mitzvos midivrei sofrim in Hilchos Megillah b'Chanukah, because this is where the Rambam treats, as he just put it, the mitzvah midivrei sofrim of saying Hallel. So, again, there's no minyan of mitzvos for mitzvos d'Rabbanan, so I wouldn't lose too much sleep over this. But to me, the pattern is unmistakable. The pattern is that the Rambam feels a certain comfort in equating Hallel with the mitzvah of Neros Chanuka. So there are 2 mitzvahs, Megillah and Neros Chanuka. The Neros Chanuka is practically interchangeable with Hallel, right? Which anyways he puts between the bracha and the hadlaka. But how can that be? The answer is because Hallel and Hodah, right, which of course overlap, they're different. One is Shevach, the other is, the personal appreciation of how that, contributes to your own life or to the life of Klal Yisrael. But either way, that both of these, according to the Rambam, are hadlakas neros al pischei batim laharos ulagalos esanes. And that's why mitzvah neros Chanukah chaviva hi ad ma'od, and it's mosif shabach and hodaya and so on. So the pattern in everything that the Rambam writes is going back to the beginning. Well, the background of the Gemara was, the Nes Pach Shemen. And then the Gemara, seemed to forget about it. Asa'um and Kava'um, the Shana Cheres, right? Yom Tov, Hallel, and Hodah. What happened to Neros Chanukah? Right? And I mentioned the Maral and the Tzfas, because you don't say Hallel because the Ribono Shel Olam made possible the performance of a mitzvah that was under pressure. You say Hallel, when there is a Yeshua. Right? But not according to the Rambam. According to the Rambam, Ner Chanukah, Chaviva hi ad ma'od, somehow is the conveyor of Hoda'ah and is equivalent to Hallel. So the question is, how can that be and why is that? So again, I want to leave some time either for questions, however you want it's supposed to be done, I don't know. But there isn't that much time. So I'm going to go to the punchline and then just mention a few things, food for thought, and then we'll stop. 2 things. Number one, Ner Chanukah, together with Megillah and Daled Kosas, but in some respects even more. I'm not going to explain the some respects even more part right now. Is a mitzvah, which I said began with, which integrates the Maisa mitzvah, a kind of an objective expression, a structure, a pu'ula, together with, the Pirsa Manes, being Megala and Modia and Mosif Shabach and Hodah in the Nes. And that's why, almost more than any other mitzvah, where you locate it, where you place it, when you do it, how long and how much shemen, right? All these things highlight Pirsumei Nisa. The Rabbi used to say in the name of his father that, the Rishonim were all troubled why Afein Hoya Ba'oso Anes, which extends, what otherwise would be Misasei Man Grama to women obligation. Like, why is that only true for Megillah, Daled Kosos, and Neros Chanukah? The Rishonim asked this question. Why aren't they? The Gemara says that women are obligated in matzah because they are, prohibited in chametz, and they are patur misukah. But there are nisim connected with sukkah. There are nisim for sure connected with Pesach, and other examples of this as well. And the Rishonim ask, the Bali Tosas ask, they give different answers. But the Ram Rittenberg's answer, and Ramosha Soloveitchik probably was unaware of this because it's in some more exotic sources, but he was mechavein to this as well, is that maybe you only say Afein Hoyu Osanes when there aren't 2 different aspects. There's the Maisa Mitzvah, and there's also like a residual effect. It's an additional factor. There are certain mitzvos where the Maisa Mitzvah itself is intended to convey, the mechayiv of that mitzvah is Pirsumei Nisa. If that is true for Megillah and Daled Kosos, which certainly it seems to be, it's even more true for everything about Chanukah, where you place it, when you do it, how much shemen, as we'll see in a moment, having an additional bracha, she'asa nisim lavosenu, a birchas haroa, how you integrate that birchas haroa, all of these things are about pirsumei nisa. So the idea that, hoda'ah or halal v'hoda'ah or shavach v'hoda'ah are particularly conveyed by Neros Chanuka is very compelling. There's a debate in the Rishonim, typically, a bracha like Ala Nisim is a birchas shavach v'hoda'ah. And typically, birchas shavach v'hoda'ah follows, doesn't precede. We say, Kol mitzvahs v'varchan aleim over l'asiyasan. Birchas mitzvah has to be prior. That's the Gemara in Pesachim, Dav Zayin. But in birchas shavach v'hoda'ah, you hear lightning, you hear thunder, all these things. They're a reaction, they're a response. You had an experience, and you break out, rhapsodically, in Shavach v'Hoda'ah to the Rabbi Shem. Right? But typically, you don't say them in advance. Megillah is also an issue. I'm not going to get into Megillah right now. But what about She'asa Nisim Lavosenu of Chanuka? So many Rishonim, many of the Chachmei Sfarad, actually said that. And Sechet Sofrim sounds that way, that you make a bracha l'hadlik ner shel Chanuka, you light the candles, and then afterwards you say She'asa Nisim Lavosenu. There were different views. But the Ramah paskins in Shulchan Aruch that it's over l'asiyasan. You make the bracha of She'asa Nisim Lavosenu also over l'asiyasan. And that's very strange. Again, it goes back to Masechet Sofrim, the minhag to sing or to say, Haneros halalu, upon, I'll take that word for a moment, lighting Neros Chanuka. When do you do that? So again, if you look at Masechet Sofrim, it seems like, after, you say Shechayanu, maybe before She'asa Nisim, you sing or you say Haneros halalu, and so on. I'm not going to try to sing it because not my particular strength. I won't burden all of you with, my musical limitations. However, again, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, the Taz in Shulchan Aruch says that the practice is, and I think most people do this, I know we do this at home, that after the first Ner, people start singing Haneros halalu as they're finishing, either some people say after the first Ner, some people say before the last Ner, as they're finishing the Hadlaka. On the surface, that should be a hefsek, right, between the Ner Rishon Beiso and the Mahadran, or the Mahadran Mina Mahadran. Why would you do that? There are numerous, other indications of this as well. But I think the answer is because if the mechayev of this Maisa mitzvah is Pirsum Anes and Hodas Shavach or Safas Shavach and Gilui Hodah, so then in a way singing Haneros Halal, telling the story, why are we doing this mitzvah? Usually you don't make a speech in the middle of a mitzvah to explain it, right? But here you do, you have to. The whole point is that it's a mode of expressing, what happened, Pirsum Anes and Hodah and Shavach Halanes. And that's why the responsive, bracha of She'asa Nisim Lavosenu, is fully integrated, into the Hadlaka itself. Ad kedei kach that there are. We'll go the opposite way. Okay, I want to finish this up. So this and many other indications prove that Neros Chanuka. That's one of the reasons that it's Chabib Kiyad Ma'od. But let me add one other dimension before we finish this. And let me highlight it through the Birchas Haroa and a couple of other things very quickly. There's a debate when it comes to the Birchas Haroa in the following type of cases, right? If a person sees Neros Chanuka, he's supposed to say She'asa Nisim Lavosenu, even if he's not mad. So let's say you haven't yet lit in your home, you went to yeshiva that day or work or whatever it was, and you're on your way home and you see somebody else's Chanukiah. Should you say She'asa Nisim Lavosenu? And you're on your way home to be madlik. So that is a big debate among the Rishonim. So on the surface, you should say, Mitzvah Bali Yodchal Tach Mitzeno. You saw the Neros. You were a roa before you had the ability to be a madlik, right? You should just make the bracha. However, Rashi, other Rishonim, some Rishonim say yes, that's what you do. And other Rishonim, Rashi among them, no. If you're on your way home to be madlik, then you don't say the Birchas Haroeh upon experiencing the Neros. On the surface, that's very strange. Like, why would you, delay the response? It's also a dilution of response, one would have thought. The first time you see it, you're more excited. The Rishonim would disagree, think that it's even a Safek Bracha, whether or not you can say it later, because the right time to say it may have been earlier. And the second time, meaning in the context of your own adlaka. Meaning, how independent is Birchas Haroeh from Birchas Hamam? There are even Shitos that think that if you are not going to fulfill your obligation, by yourself, you're going to be Yotzei Neri Shabeso through your home, let's say whatever, but let's say you're on the road somewhere, you can't be madlik yourself, you're relying on the Anshe Beso to fulfill this mitzvah, right? But you see somebody else's Chanukiah. So then, many more Rishonim, even the ones who said, if you're going home, even if you're going home later, that you should hold out the bracha, many, many more of them say, well, in this circumstance, of course, that's what Birchas Haroeh is all about. But there's still a group of Rishonim who disagree, and who think that if you're being Yotzei, Hadlakas Neros Chanukah at home, then you should not make a separate Birchas Haroeh, because you're Mitzuraf, and your Birchas Haroeh, or Birchas Haroeh for you is Mitzuraf to the Hadlaka that takes place at home. That's astonishing. But that's a, semi-prominent shita. And the question is why? Like, why would you say that? There's another debate, just to highlight one more time. There's a, there's a certain ingenuity in, testing halachic categories. So let's say you want to use, the shemen of Isurei Hana, you shouldn't, but talking about ingenuity. Somebody wants to contemplate using the shemen of Isurei Hana to fulfill the mitzvah of Neros Chanukah. So we have this principle of, Ktute Mechtat Shiure, that if something is going to be, especially if it's something that is Chayiv Sreifa, not just Isurei Hana, that you, it doesn't, Ktute Mechtat Shiure, you can't use it for anything that requires a shiur. So, for example, a lulav, shalashera is ktute mechtat shiurei. It's a din that applies to many din. So the poskim discusses about Neros Chanukah. Let's say you have shemen, which has to be burnt, and you want to use it for Neros Chanukah. Does it work or not? So some poskim say, of course it works. You can't apply ktute mechtat shiurei, because the Pirsume Nisa aspect of the Hadlaka really highlights the effect, right? And you could say, Tute Mechtat Shiur all day long if you want. Say, oh, Al Pidin, formally this thing doesn't have a shear, but, somebody walking by who doesn't know, or even if he does know, that you're using Shemen Shel, Chiyuv Sreifa, Isurei Hana, he's seeing the lights, right? He may not be seeing the light, but he's seeing the lights. And therefore, the effect of Pirsume Nisa, is there. Mashal Ma'adavar Doma is like a famous discussion. Reb Chaim has this discussion about a lechi, and the Ketzav Mishnah has this discussion about a sandal shel chalitza. That you have a sandal shel chalitza, and there's a din of Ktute Mechtat Shiurei in what it's composed of. It doesn't affect it because certain halachos are effect oriented. They're Lemaisa, like you have to have something that covers your foot. You have to have something, that has a little bit of bulk. So even if formally it doesn't have a shear, what's the din of Ktute Mechtat Shiurei? When does it apply? Whenever there's a legal and formal shear, right? You have to have X amount of tfachim for the daled minim, right? So it's Ktute Mechtat Shiurei. Okay. Why am I telling you all this? So if Neros Chanukah is about the effect, then you're not going to say Ktute Mechtat Shiurei. Why would you ever say it? So there's a dialectic, there's like an interesting tension between these two aspects of Neros. I'll give you another quick example. Let's say you need to have shemen in the, or a candle that has the capacity to burn for how long? Well, firstly, Achatikal Regam Nashuk is a big debate, right? You live in the city that never sleeps. Does that mean you have to have a much, and what time, right? Does it depend on people's behavior? This is a massive debate, but it comes down to, is it a shiur of half an hour or whatever, or is it the effect? But another example, let's say you have shemen, right? But you don't have enough for half an hour, I would say, or for the longer required so, but you want to do the hadlaka, right? So you start the hadlaka, there's not enough shiur. Can you add the shiur shemen in later, or does it have to be there bisman a hadlaka? That's a major debate among the early Rishon. B'kitzur, what I'm trying to show is that even though Neros Chanuka is so focused in a very mechudash way on the effect, on the message of Pirsumei Nisa, and in that sense it's a practical, effect-oriented mitzvah, nonetheless there's an equal body of evidence that suggests, and in some cases, in something like the Birkas HaRoeh, which fundamentally is about Pirsumei Nisa, that it needs to be integrated into the structure of the Maisa mitzvah. And the question is why? But I think that this phenomenon goes back to the first question that we asked and will allow us to sum it all up. And that is, like we pointed out, right? It's very peculiar, the role that this Maisa mitzvah plays. It seems inordinately significant relative to the Muhammad. And, again, the Rambam certainly, promoted it, that's what Hodah means. And Chaviva, he ad ma'od. What is this focus on this particular mitzvah in this context? But I think it all goes back to the original problem. And that is, when the Rambam described the history, the background, right, the first thing he established was that this was Shas HaShmad. And as I mentioned, Shas HaShmad is a very extraordinary category. Like, how can it be that Yohareg Vayav or Afilo Arkasa de Masana and you don't even have a Makar? So there are some who suggest that Arkasa de Masana in a time of religious crisis kind of becomes Avodah Zarah. At least in the Begida, in the loyal, it's like a loyalty test. Are you with the Ribono Shel Olam, or with those who are attacking the very concept of religion? So even Arkasa de Masana is like raised to the level of Avodah Zarah, and that may be true, and it may also be overlapping with what I'm about to say. But certainly Rashi in Sanhedrin seems to say something a little different, something to the effect that in the Shas HaShmad, if you don't draw the line, then you kind of get, you whittle away at religious commitment to such an extent that nothing is left. Meaning, of course, in isolation, the Arkasa de Masana and the other mitzvahs kalos and anything but the Gimel Averos, if you look at it narrowly, they don't justify sacrificing life itself, the Chai Bahem. But you look at it, the aggregate, you're living in a climate, right, in which spiritual mediocrity, is the rule, and basically you're being denied religious freedom. It goes back to the story of Rabbi Akiva in the end of Masachet Brachos. If you can't, survive with Torah and with mitzvos, it's even more difficult to survive without. The idea that spiritual mediocrity, is a slow death, a death by, whittling away, things that establish the meaning of life, that concept is at the root of Arkasa de Masana of Shas HaShmad. So what the Rambam is telling us is that really, bitlu daitam, the prohibition against Torah mitzvos, is not just a technical point which triggered the Milchama. It's a principle, and that is you cannot separate for long, and if you try to do it in principle, Kabbalas Malchus Shemayim from Kabbalas Mitzvos. There's Parshas Kriya Shema, Parshas Vayim Shemoah, the Gemara in Brachos, Mishnah Brachos, Taftes, talks about their connection. In a time of Shas HaShmad, it may look like all that's being negated is Kabbalas Mitzvos, but in the end, that erodes and doesn't allow any kind of meaningful Kabbalas Malchus Shemayim either. And if that's the case, the whole milchama was pursued, like, why did they go to war? They went to war to fight for religious freedom because they understood that that also is part of the existential foundation, of national and individual life. And therefore, the milchama, while it was more necessary, once they, engaged in it, but in a way it wasn't really the purpose. They could have avoided the milchama. What motivated the milchama was this perspective on Torah mitzvos. And therefore, in the immediate aftermath of the milchama, it became critical to reassert that centrality, the dominant role that Torah mitzvos play in defining a meaningful life for individuals and for the Jewish people. And for that reason, two things happened at the same time. On the one hand, the mitzvah of Neros Chanuka, kind of is this modality of like expressing not only, chavivus ha-mitzvah, but chavivus ha-mitzvah because in a way it's all about Hallel and Hodah. But at the same time, the Hallel and Hodah, even as they are a kiyum, and they're expressed in the timing and many other dinim of the mitzvah of Neros Chanuka, they also have to be integrated into the objective Maisa mitzvah. Because if not, then you wouldn't be accurately portraying or projecting the goal of the milchama, or the purpose of the milchama, and the goal of Chanuka itself. If everything was to reassert the prominent, central, indispensable role of Torah mitzvos, so then even the effect part had to integrate with the substance and the objective structure part of the mitzvah of Neros Chanuka. So that is why Neros Chanuka Chavivahi really ad ma'od, because it's the integration of these two ideas, each one feeding off the other. At a moment in history where there was like kind of an epiphany, a national epiphany about what made life meaningful, and obviously, you're all in a very special place and focusing on Talmud Torah and Shmiras HaMitzvos and growing as Ovdei Hashem under the watchful eye of your Rabbeim, each of whom is a very special person and mentor. And as we get closer to the holiday of Chanuka, appreciating being in an environment, with your Chaverim and your Rabbeim, in the place where you intensify your lifelong commitment to Talmud Torah is really an opportunity to have a special kind of Chanuka, and especially in a time of national crisis where there is an existential battle going on. And, it's a physical battle for survival, but it really is also, like in the time of Chanuka, it's really about the values also that differentiate us, from others, the concept of Kedusha, which of course is the embodiment of Talmud Torah, but also of objective Shmiras HaMitzvos. Thank you.